All right. We're back for what may actually end up being, might be our final episode of Cobbled Together. We'll have to see what keeps happening. But joining me is my friend Kristy Perano. Kristy, as always, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I feel like at this point we're basically co-hosts of this particular program. Yeah. So we gone.
Yeah. For the first time in 20 years, there are theoretically no American troops in Afghanistan. I say theoretically because the U.S. does have classified missions in a lot of parts of the world. So without being privy to all the classified intel, there could be some classified ops in Afghanistan still. But as far as the official statement and any non-classified missions are completely over.
Yeah. But you say that there could be American troops, but there are definitely Americans.
Yeah, there are definitely stranded Americans, and anywhere from like a couple hundred to potentially thousands. I mean, at the beginning of this, we were told that there were 10 to 15,000 American citizens in Afghanistan. Then we were told that they extracted 5,400 of them, and then the next thing we were told was there's 200 left, and 10,000 minus 5,400 is not 200. So so I'm not sure what the discrepancy is, and if there's apparently just a few hundred that are in active touch, and then they're gonna, I don't know where maybe the initial ones were overestimates, but we've never seen a like real detailed explanation of why the State Department overestimated it by a factor of 2, or what happened to the other half of the Americans there. But definitely there's still a few hundred that are stranded. They've stopped even telling us how many green card holders are stranded, which means it could be in the thousands. And then there's probably at least 65,000 SIV applicants, which is special immigrant visa, which is U.S. military interpreters and others. There's at least 60-some thousand of them and family members. Through the official evacuation efforts, about 10% were probably evacuated, but we were starting with a population of about 90,000 or so. So there's at least, a conservative estimate would be at least 70,000 are left. I think if you assume there were 80,000 and then you assume 10 or 15,000 made it out.
Wow.
And then there's probably a couple 100,000 other Afghans with like U.S. connections that the Taliban will be happy to kill them when they find them. So it's a huge humanitarian catastrophe to now have like hundreds of thousands of people in hiding in a country that's now run by terrorists.
Yeah, no good way of splicing it. And the only thing that seems to be good news for the Biden administration is, if my Twitter feed is anything to go by, this whole thing seems to have faded from the news completely.
Yeah, I think though that I did see a news story yesterday in Politico that the White House chief of staff said that there's one Afghan interpreter who's still stranded in Afghanistan who played a role in like saving Biden and a couple other senators back in 2008, and then he reached out to the Biden administration during the evacuations and they did absolutely nothing. So he is still in hiding in Afghanistan. So I think Republicans and others probably capitalized on his story enough that now the Biden administration said, I want to say it was on Friday, I think it's Ronald Klain, the chief of staff. He said, well, we're going to figure out how to get him out of Afghanistan and get the other SIVs out too. So and then I think State Department said something recently about how they were still working on trying to get SIVs out. It's not exactly clear what mechanisms are, but there is some rumors that they may work with neighboring countries to try to allow people to cross through a neighboring country if they can get to the border. There is also talk of NATO trying to do more evacuation flights, probably collaborating with Turkey and Qatar, who are now running the airport to try to get some flights. And the Taliban is apparently saying that they will allow citizens and people with visas of other countries to leave, which the US has a list of like military interpreters and stuff, but a lot of them, they have this lengthy SIV visa process, which can take years. And I was on the phone with someone today, not from State Department, but a veteran who's working on this issue, and like State Department is not giving any satisfactory answers for like now they're saying, well, people can sponsor them for humanitarian parole, but there is a fee waiver process, but if you don't get it waived, then you have to pay $575 per family member to do humanitarian parole. It can take quite a bit of time, speaking from personal experience, to actually write the case. You have forms to fill out, and if you don't fill them out correctly, it gets rejected. And you also need someone to sign to take financial responsibility. And so now you're asking Americans to take full financial responsibility for people they may not even know very well. So it's a total, if the State Department does not come up with a different answer for like left behind SIVs, other than like, well, if you're able to bribe your way through one of the closed borders, let us know to transfer your case, or otherwise, if you find some American to apply for humanitarian parole sometime in the next 2 or 3 months, you might get permission to try to navigate through a bunch of Taliban checkpoints and get on a plane. Like that is not a reasonable mechanism at all. It's an absurd position to put these people in, and to put Americans trying to help in. Like a bunch of people are going to die if you don't like sign up to take financial responsibility for someone you may not even know. Like that's not okay either. So it's very frustrating that what the State Department is saying just seems totally disconnected with the reality of what these people are dealing with.
Right. And I want to now talk about how the Taliban is governing the country. I'm just going to share my screen right here because this just appeared in my feed. Let's see, I've searched on yet. Let's listen to this.
Hello everyone, I'm Natasha Fatah reporting from the CBC newsroom. There are reports that Taliban militants in Afghanistan have fatally shot and killed a policewoman. Local media referred to her as Banu Nigar, and she was killed at her family home. Now, the Taliban deny any responsibility, but reports locally indicate that the Taliban beat and shot Nigar dead in front of her husband and her children. You can read more details online.
Hello. So that should give a sense, like, is that an accurate reflection about how the Taliban is running the country?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, they're trying to show to the world that they're like the new Taliban and they're not doing this kind of thing. And there are different factions in the Taliban, and there may be some individuals in the Taliban that don't support this kind of thing, but there's the Taliban absolutely has not cut ties with Al-Qaeda. We've known that the whole time. And all of their promises about forgiveness have been empty promises. So it does seem, I think in some ways they are holding back from what they could be doing. Like I think they are killing people, but they're trying to keep it on the down low, and they're not like just, mass executing people by the tens of thousands yet, because they're trying to like get some assets unfrozen and things like that. And I think they're also just sort of hoping that people stop paying as much attention to them before they do as much stuff. But they have been actively hunting and killing people this entire time, and there is no indication that the Taliban is any different than the murderous rampages that they've been for the last 20 years, well, more than 20 years. Like there is no legitimate indication that the Taliban have reformed. I think any restraint we're seeing now is probably just in the interest of letting international attention die down before they really show their true colors. But yeah, I have no confidence, and I don't think any reasonable person has any confidence that the Taliban is going to do anything other than try to find and kill people who had worked for the US.
Yeah, international attention might die down. We're definitely going to stay on it. Honestly, I wish that you were right, that all Republicans, are gonna seize on this and then really hold the Biden administration's feet to the fire on terms of Afghanistan. Unfortunately, you've had Republicans like J.D. Vance, who's running for U.S. Senate in Ohio, who are basically saying, let's not take in refugees. Let's not. And you had like people I used to respect, like Joe Walsh, who basically said, the the Biden administration, handled this well.
Yeah, I don't get that at all. I am so frustrated with some of these like never Trumpers that claim to be conservative and then based on principle oppose Trump, which I can understand that, but now they've just morphed into Biden fanboys. And I'm like, the principle, or fangirls in Jennifer Rubin's case, like a principled approach is to hold everybody accountable, whether it's Trump negotiating with the Taliban and being corrupt and mishandling things, then I mean, even those of us that are more Republican in our views, I mean, a significant portion of, I mean, not all that many in Congress, but like there was this movement of Never Trump, and it was basically people saying, okay, look, I am kind of a Republican by ideology, but I'm going to oppose Trump because I have principles. But if you then just switch over to defending the Biden administration at all costs, you're not really making a principled stand. You're just switching teams. And it's like, let's get rid of the red jersey and put on a blue jersey now. And I've been unfollowing all such people on Twitter and then following some of the people that have recently followed me, because if somebody's not intellectually honest enough to be trying to give a fair analysis of like what's going on, then I don't really want to hear their opinions on other things either, if they just want to defend Biden at all costs.
Yeah, no, this is definitely like a make or break moment. Like if you're showing your true colors now, I'll think twice about following you. Yeah, no, I'm just go looking at my Twitter feed and trying to see like people obfuscate. I'm not going to name names here, but people are like obfuscating, like changing the subject. You have people on the left who on the other side who are saying oh, the GOP is like America's Taliban, so which is equally ridiculous.
Right, you can disagree with stuff the GOP does, but it cheapens the reality of how bad these groups are. Even if you say that, oh, well, this is, just like the Ku Klux Klan or whatever, it's like, well, the Ku Klux Klan was actually hunting down and brutally murdering people. And yes, if you have some domestic terrorist group now that is hunting down and brutally murdering people and you want to compare them to the Taliban or Ku Klux Klan, go ahead. But if you just strongly disagree with stuff they're doing, but they're not actually torturing and murdering people as a general practice, then it just cheapens the reality of how bad that is for either present or historic groups if you just go around and compare everything to that. I mean, because like if you're going to compare Republicans to the Taliban, that means the Taliban is no worse than Republicans. So then, yeah, why would we be upset about them taking over the country? So yeah, I have little patience for those sorts of analogies.
Do you think, honestly, given the situation with the SIV applicants and the fact that basically like a good 90% of them haven't made it to America, just is that going to weaken America's position around the world? Like America has troops in Iraq, and is it? I've asked you this question before, but I feel like I have to keep asking it because it's just something that I always bother by. The idea that when America goes into a country that doesn't speak English, that they're going to have a harder time for the next generation operating because the people who speak the language there are not going to want to help the U.S. because, like, yeah, I don't have any belief that I'm actually going to make it to American soil. Why should I help you?
Right, that's absolutely an issue, and that's why I believe that a lot of the veterans community are genuinely care about, like, these are people we work with, people we know, and we don't want our friends to get murdered. I think that like I think the moral basis is very compelling for veterans as well. But I think one of the reasons that the veterans and national security community are so upset about this is not only the moral aspect of leaving people behind to get murdered because they helped you, but also, like you said, the national security aspect is that how are you ever going to get intelligence or cooperation from people if they're just signing their own death warrant? And it is true that 90% of the people that were in the current SIV pipeline or somewhere in that vicinity have been left behind. The SIV process has been going on for a number of years, so there are like tens of thousands of Afghans that have successfully resettled through the program. But the whole time, dating back to the Obama administration, the program has been lengthy and full of unlawful delays and arbitrary denials and things like that. So it's important to remember that when we say 90% of them are left behind, that was 90% of pending applicants as of like August 2021, not 90% of people who ever worked for the US military at any point in time, because tens of thousands of those are already in the US as SAVs or refugees. But there's absolutely no excuse for the way that advocates have been begging the Biden administration for months. I mean, we talked about this months ago, is that they need to evacuate the SAVs. There was absolutely no reason not to do that as they were withdrawing troops. And I am in touch with a couple of interpreters. One of them was fortunate enough to make it to Germany he was on one of the last flights. And he is in Germany now, and then another one that's still in hiding. And they were working with the US military until like the mission closed, and then they get laid off because the mission has closed. And then we just said, well, thanks for your service. Now you can just hang out in this country that the Taliban is working on taking over, and they'll murder this person in a few months. So these guys have been living in hiding for a few months, and now they're like on the run from the Taliban. And it's just like insane that we would say, oh, we're winding down the mission, and we know that we're potentially letting the Taliban take over, but we're not going to take the people embedded with our troops with us as we go. But that's what happened. They just like, well, mission's over, you can go home now. And then they just leave the country and leave these guys to the mercy of the Taliban. And they have had like dozens of veterans and veterans organizations and the entire national security community telling them for months, you've got to evacuate these people and not just leave them to the Taliban. And it's like, oh, don't worry, everything's fine. We're expediting the SAV process and all this stuff. And some of us were saying, look, if it's been broken and backlogged for years, you can't fix all that in a few months. And they do actually have some good things going in terms of trying to fix the SAV. Like they are working to expedite processes. And if someone couldn't get an HR letter, they're trying to like find electronic records of that and stuff like that. So they are doing some good stuff in terms of expediting the SAV. But the problem is you've left these people with no way to support their families and like hiding from the Taliban, who are actively searching for them. And it's not a sustainable situation. If they had actually evacuated all the SAVs and then they had them in some camp in some third country, and then they're like, okay, now we're gonna figure out how to do this this process more efficiently, then I'd be like, okay, yeah, that's reasonable. But it's good that they're trying to make some reforms, but it is really like very much too little too late if you're going to just leave them all to the mercy of the Taliban, because they're still not going to live long enough to get an SAV, even if it's 6 months instead of 2 years that it takes.
Right. No promises that I can make right now. There's a chance that we might have someone on just to talk about the political implications in terms of, things like the midterms next year. Not making any promises. He may or may not show up, but we'll see what ends up happening. But I guess I'll pose the question to you, Kristy. What do you think the political implications of this whole pullout could be? Because Biden's approval rating has plummeted in the last month, in just the last few weeks with the disastrous pullout. So there are signs that there could potentially be electoral consequences for the disastrous way that this was handled, especially if the polling numbers, which were already starting to decline before the pullout, but accelerated under it. That could harm Democrats in the midterms. Like, do you see that potentially happening in the midterms or even sooner?
Yeah, I do think so. I think like what the Biden administration is hoping is that Afghanistan will like be the next Yemen, where there's a huge humanitarian crisis, but they succeed in keeping terrorist groups disrupted enough that there's no attacks on the American homeland, and everyone just sort of tunes it out. So I think that's what they're hoping for, and then they're hoping that it won't have political implications. But I think like only 8% of Americans say that we're safer because of the Afghanistan pullout, which is kind of incredible that 92% either don't have an opinion or feel less safe now. So I think to some extent it depends on what happens in Afghanistan in the next few months. If you I think we will continue to see like reports of some of these Americans who are currently stuck there are going to make it out and are going to be political gold for Republicans because they can put them on a witness stand to talk about how the Taliban prevented them from getting on the flights through the airport. The State Department did nothing to help them and left them behind, and they made some harrowing escape, and that is not going to look good for them. And also there's going to continue to be reports of people and various interpreters that were killed that probably were in advanced stages of the visa just because no one bothered to get them out. I think there's going to be reports of a lot of corruption that went on in the evacuation efforts. I mean, there were a lot of people removed through that airport in a short amount of time. But there have been very persistent reports, like I was hearing from sources on the ground, multiple sources on the ground, that there were a lot of Afghan army people that either on behalf of themselves or on behalf of like the CIA and Eric Prince's like contractors of the CIA that were saying, well, hey, if you give us $2,000 or $5,000 or $6,000, you know, we'll put you on a plane. And so I think that's part of how you ended up with only 10% of these people that were evacuated were actual US military interpreters. And you just have a huge number of people that the administration says were at-risk Afghans, and no one even knows who they were or how they got on the list. And some of them are probably like Christians or other religious minorities that, you know, some organization got on the State Department list. So I'm sure that there are plenty of people that were not US military interpreters that have a valid claim to be at risk and like deserve to be evacuated. But I think you're going to see more and more, like at the beginning, the Biden administration is like, oh, look, we saved 120,000 people. Isn't this great? But I think you're going to see more and more reports of people that were left behind being killed or making a harrowing escape. And that's going to be like political gold for Republicans. I think whether or not they deserve to be able to use it, they will. And obviously, you know, as you and I know, Trump started this process of negotiating with the Taliban, and then some of these Republicans said, yeah, after 18 years, it's time for something new. You know, we commend Trump's bravery and courage and you know, wisdom in negotiating with the Taliban. And then 2 years later, they're like, why would any idiot do this? And so, yeah, there's plenty of hypocrisy to go around. But also I think I think it depends a bit on like how much it stays in the media attention and how much these stories of people being killed and or escaping after the evacuation was over and they were left behind get traction. But then I think another huge factor is what really does end up happening in Afghanistan now. Like the Taliban is now in control of the government. The Taliban, we know, is continuing to collaborate with Al-Qaeda, even though they made empty promises about not doing so, and has supposedly told the US that they don't even want the US to do any counter ISIS operations. So you could have ISIS and Al-Qaeda trying to take over the country before long, and they're definitely going to have more space to operate. And so there's just sort of this assumption that everyone's going to forget about Afghanistan and the situation will be controlled enough that if you don't really care about Afghans, then you can just ignore it. But like, what if there is a large-scale terrorist attack that was, I mean, we're back to pre 9/11 now, Afghanistan, in terms of the country's run by the Taliban, cooperating with Al-Qaeda, and an intelligence like black hole because we don't even have any contacts on the ground that can tell us about what's going on there. So then what if there is a significant terrorist attack that is traced back to Al-Qaeda? All of a sudden, that is a huge political liability because, you know, if you have, you know, 200 people get killed in some bombing in New York City or whatever, and it gets traced back to Al-Qaeda, then all of a sudden Republicans can capitalize on that and say, see, this is what happens. You withdrew from Afghanistan and caused a disaster, and now all these Americans are dead. And but of course, I'm not hoping for that, and I don't know for sure that that's going to happen. But I think that's a very serious risk that the situation in Afghanistan is so out of control that it leads to terrorist attacks on the homeland or in Europe or things like that. And you know, and then some people that fled in the chaos probably were going to be Taliban operatives or whatever. So that's another thing that could happen, is that some of these, and I hope that countries have a good enough plan to vet these refugees, and like I absolutely support resettling large numbers of Afghans, but also when you allow just chaotic evacuation, is like, are some of these undocumented people just people that actually are bad actors that just destroyed their documents so we don't know who they are? And I think the US has, though, biometric systems in place so that they should hopefully be able to catch anybody who like has Taliban ties that managed to bribe their way onto a plane. but there is that. I think the bigger risk is that Al-Qaeda gets a free pass from the Taliban to get their act together and start launching international terrorist attacks again. But obviously there's also there is some risk that there could be bad actors that get mixed in with all the refugees as well. And vetting people that are from a failed state, it becomes more difficult because now like a lot of these records have been destroyed. So how do you even, so how do you vet some of these people that were not SIV applicants? How do you tell the difference between some Christian who could never afford to buy a passport or some Taliban operative who destroyed his passport and claimed he was a Christian? I mean, and that's part of the problem with the corruption that we were seeing, is that gave the corruption and chaos and the whole evacuation gave an opportunity to bad actors, and had the idea that the State Department had was that they were going to compile this list and it was going to be based on organizations and known people being recommended and stuff like that. And then you're not going to have some, international organization that recommends bad actors in general. They're going to have vetted and vouched for the people they put on the list, but the list was not followed at all. I don't think more than 20 or 30% of the people evacuated were probably from the official State Department list. Well, actually, I don't know what percentage, but I think a huge percentage like bribed their way on, or were just in the right place at the right time or whatever. So it's not like everybody was picked for a reason. There was a lot of people that no one really knows how or why they ended up getting evacuated, but they did.
Yeah. Okay. I'm gonna pause right here. I just found out we're not gonna have this particular guest on tonight. Not gonna say who he is. We might have it next week to talk about the political implications of the withdrawal, including the effect of the midterms, whether Biden will be impeached or whether there could be forced resignations involved. I definitely want to talk about that in a future episode. And but for now, we're gonna keep on this. Okay, so Kristy, where can people follow you?
I'm pretty active on Twitter. I'm at Kristy Perano, which is Kristy, and then my last name Perano.
Yeah,
I've been tweeting pretty exclusively about like what's going on in Afghanistan and Afghan evacuation. I also tweet about other national security stuff and refugees in general and stuff. It's been more focused on Afghanistan, but as our extended evacuation efforts wind down, I mean, in the future I will probably take on more topics, but right now I'm fairly single issue on my Twitter.
And you can follow me at Overlord Johnny, and we're both probably gonna keep an eye on this. Kristy, we'll have you back next week.
Yeah.
All
Thanks
right.
for having me.
Take care in the meantime.